Russian missiles and drones blasted civilian buildings in Ukraine, Chinese President Xi Jingping concluded what he called a journey of friendship and peace to Moscow. His warm reception there comes as no surprise. Vladimir Putin is badly in need of friends after the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for his arrest. He's clearly hoping that Xi's grand display of solidarity will translate into economic and military support to help Russia cope with sanctions-induced shortages. China has bigger aims, nothing less than rebalancing global geopolitics. So we're asking, Putin under pressure, is China the winner in the Ukraine war? Hello and welcome. It is a great pleasure to greet our guests. Angela Stanzel is Senior Policy Fellow in the Asia Program at the Berlin-based think tank SWP. Sudha David-Wilp is Senior Fellow and Regional Director in the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund. And my DW colleague Vladimir Esipov works on our Russian desk. And Vladimir, if I may start with you, Putin absolutely pulled out all the stops on this visit. Xi Jinping even got to sit at a small, intimate little table with Putin rather than in that infinitely long one that's reserved for Western guests. Yet Putin's body language seemed to indicate that he was actually a bit uneasy compared to Xi.
He might be being uneasy in the body language terms, but for him it was a huge boost of support from China. It was the biggest and strongest signal he would ever need right now, 2 or 3 days of Chinese president in Moscow, with this show of support, with this show of strength. And another important thing, it's not only what's happened in Moscow, but what didn't happen. Namely, the Chinese president didn't call Zelensky in Kiev. Zelensky is still waiting to talk to him. And the Ukrainian government trying to establish a kind of links to Beijing. And it failed since 1 year, because since the beginning of the war, there was no direct contact between Zelensky and Xi Jinping. And it's a very interesting signal as well.
Both of which, of course, go to the peace aspect of this visit, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. Sudha, prior to the visit, there was actually some speculation amongst Western media about whether Xi would truly go, given that the International Criminal Court had just issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. Certainly, and I don't want to put too much weight on body language, but certainly Xi didn't look very uncomfortable or embarrassed about his proximity to Putin on this visit.
No, not at all. And in fact, I think for President Xi, it was also a way of showing that China has the upper hand in this relationship with Russia. What started out as a friendship without limits last year on the eve of the war is now looking like a relationship where China calls the shots. And I think, of course, Russia benefits because it's looking to secure new energy partnerships. An agricultural deal was apparently also inked. So these are all good things for Russia, but it's clear that the relationship is now asymmetrical. And I will say that although that meeting occurred in Moscow, it was also interesting to see Japanese Prime Minister Kishida visiting Zelensky in Kyiv.
It was a highly symbolic step by the Japanese.
Angela, so, a journey of peace and friendship, and yet peace got a lot more short shrift than the friendship part of this. So was the peace plan that she had announced prior to the visit essentially just window dressing?
I mean, first of all, I think it's not precisely a peace plan, it's a position paper. And Xi Jinping presented this in the Chinese translation, it's called a position paper. And he presented his position and he reaffirmed his position with this visit. The position of China is partly low-hanging fruits in terms of no use of nuclear weapons, no attack of nuclear facilities, etc. But also, of course, there is the peace element in there, which is that China is requesting a ceasefire between the two countries, without, of course, offering any details on how this ceasefire should come about. So yes, it serves also to boost China's image of sort of mediator or even peace broker, as China has done between Saudi Arabia and Iran just recently.
And we will come back to the peace part of all of this, but let's drill down now on the friendship aspect. If, as the two sides claim, this is a no-limits friendship, it's not exactly between equals.
Chinese head of state Xi Jinping's arrival in an American-designed XXL jumbo jet is, in itself, a demonstration of power toward his Russian friends. A few days earlier, this video emerged of Russian President Vladimir Putin on a PR trip to the occupied territory of Mariupol behind the wheel of a Japanese car, instead of a Russian or Chinese vehicle. These images make one thing clear: both countries still depend on Western technology. But this should come to an end soon, as it becomes abundantly clear which country is more of the junior partner in this joint operation. China is currently buying energy and raw materials from Russia at especially favorable prices. By contrast, Russian accounts make up only 3% of China's trade balance. Putin, now an alleged war criminal wanted by the International Criminal Court, urgently needs new weapons to continue his military conquests, along with other supplies from China that are no longer provided by the West. Our industrial cooperation is deepening. There is good experience in the construction of civil aircraft, shipbuilding, and automotive production. We are ready to support Chinese businesses. Are Putin's weaknesses turning Russia into a Chinese vassal state?
I'll pass that question right over to Vladimir. And in fact, a number of Western analysts concluded that the visit does cement Russia's status as a Chinese vassal. Are they jumping to conclusions?
Well, I would not use the word vassal, but junior partner is a good description of this relationship, because if you look just on China economic might in the Russian market, China grabbing the shares left by Western companies on the Russian markets. In Russia, it's only 14 Western car producers left inside of the country. 11 of them are Chinese. And Chinese companies dominating 75% of the Russian smartphone sales. So the Westerns giving up on Russia, and Chinese taking these shares for them. And in terms of Russian economy, which is extremely important for Putin to keep the domestic stability strong, you need stable economy. He needs China and Chinese investment and Chinese money.
Vladimir, if Vladimir Putin is so upset about the U.S. and the West encroaching on Russia, why would he allow Russia to become a junior partner, subservient to this massive, massive power to his east?
The message from Moscow to the Western world is we can perfectly survive without your money, without your investment, without the good relationship to the US, to Europe, to Brussels, to Berlin, to whoever in the West. We don't need liberal democracy as a state concept. We are perfectly fine on ourselves, and we look for our partners, senior partners, junior partners, whatever, by ourselves. So we are fine on ourselves. So it's a big bye to the Western democracies in general.
Sudha, China and Russia don't actually use the term alliance when they talk about this relationship. So how allied are they? Is this comparable, this tie to, let's say, Germany and France as NATO allies?
Well, I think the U.S. administration is sort of describing it as a relationship of convenience because, as Vladimir said, you know, they both have an interest in dismantling the global order that the U.S. built after World War II, because China says it feels contained by the United States. Russia is obviously, you know, in the doghouse with the West at the moment, and it will take probably many years for Moscow to gain trust with the European countries in this Western alliance. So I think that right now they both see joining up as an advantage in terms of taking away relative power from the United States and the West.
Nonetheless, Angela, looking at the longer-term picture, would you say that Putin is suffering from tunnel vision, in a sense, when he makes a pact with the devil simply to spite the West?
Well, I mean, that's probably a very simple version of it. I think a partnership with China is the lesser evil, even though Russia may not always like all aspects of it. It's also something that, has been developing since many years, even before Ukraine, that Russia increasingly became more a junior partner to China. It started basically already during the sanctions following Crimea and so on. He kind of knows his place, but let's not forget that Russia also has power beyond economic might, and that is still the case, in particular military clout in regions such as the Middle East. And I think this is why I agree it's not a vassal, it's more of a junior partner. And Russia will still push through its interests, even though China may not like it very much. But of course, on the other hand, on the long term, what we see is that Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China on many fronts, probably even on the military front, technology front in the far future, because Russia is investing everything now in this war, which also means that China will have more of a say in regions where Russia used to dominate. Let's look at the Arctic, for example. I think China will have much more room to navigate there without taking in consideration Russian feelings.
Vladimir, you said that the ties with China do have economic advantages for Russia. However, Russia is selling China oil and gas at rock bottom prices. Some cynics have said in the past that Russia is I'm quoting John McCain here, the U.S. Senator. He said some time ago already, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. Is Putin essentially locking Russia into that kind of a status?
Sorry to say, but Russia is not a gas station. Russia is much more than a gas station. If you look what's happening in Africa, it's not only Arctic, but in Africa, it's perfectly fine cooperation between China and Russia. China building the infrastructure in many African countries, and Russia washing the brains on Africans, because the influence of Russian info welfare in Africa is extremely, extremely strong. So it's cooperation on many different levels. It's so much more than gas and oil. It's on a global scale. It's against the United States, against the Western ideology, against the liberal democracy as a state concept, and against a whole set of the Western values we used to have here in the West. It's so much more for them on an ideological level than only selling oil and gas.
Sudha, China and Russia regularly hold joint military drills. And for some weeks, even I think now a couple of months, U.S. intelligence services have been warning that they believe China is getting close to supplying Russia with important military goods, including ammunition. Russia desperately short of ammunition at the moment, as well as possibly drones and other weapons. Do you think that that will indeed occur? Would you expect to see China provide Russia with the military support that it clearly badly needs?
Well, I mean, I think, China is probably providing Russia with dual-use technology and supplying Russia with products that could perhaps help in the war. But certainly the step of providing lethal weapons is a big one, which would obviously also ruin China's credibility in terms of trying to position itself as an honest broker in mediating a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And I think it would also put China in a hard position vis-a-vis Europe as a trading partner, because I think Europeans will be then be stuck between a rock and a hard place if the U.S. then slaps additional sanctions against China, and Europe would be forced to follow along when there are very strong trading ties between China and Europe.
I want to come back to that point in a moment, but just from the Chinese perspective, Angela, if I may, having positioned himself so very firmly on Putin's side, Xi Jinping can scarcely afford, in terms of saving face, to have Russia lose the war in Ukraine. Isn't that right?
I think that's precisely right. Also because for China, there's a huge uncertainty about the alternative. Should, for example, Putin fail and his regime collapse for some reason, what would be the replacement of that? Also, having a loser on his side in this war would then damage China's image. So I think this is a reason why he went to Russia to talk to Putin personally. And it's quite remarkable, I think, that this visit is 3 days long. And I think we only see a minimal snippet of what is happening there and what they are actually talking about. I think for a long time we will not know what they have discussed behind closed doors. But I think we can be sure that the aim was to ensure that there is some sort of an exit of this, preserving the regime of Putin.
Let's come back to the peace dimension of this 3-day visit. As mentioned, prior to his trip, Xi had released a 12-point position paper. Can China truly play the role of mediator, or is its plan nothing more than window dressing?
Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow with a clear strategy. He wants to show the U.S. and the rest of the world that China is a political superpower. After a successful mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Xi now plans to move forward with his 12-point plan for peace in Ukraine. On the Ukrainian crisis, China has always upheld the principles of the United Nations Charter, taken an objective and neutral position, and actively promoted peace and dialogue. Officially, China has tried to strike a delicate balance of not supplying weapons to Russia and opposing its nuclear weapons program, while maintaining a close relationship under Xi's leadership. Is Xi succeeding in walking this difficult tightrope between Russia and the West?
And let me ask you, Sudha, many Western analysts now say that they think the war will probably end with an uneasy ceasefire of some sort, and the optimists hope that perhaps such a ceasefire would then include at least some parts of Donbass once again being under Ukrainian control. Is it conceivable that China could play a constructive role in moving both sides toward that kind of a ceasefire?
Well, China certainly has leverage over Russia and, also has some leverage when it comes to Ukraine, because Ukraine will face lots of, a daunting task in terms of reconstructing the country after the battle is over, and China could play a role there. But I think it's pretty disingenuous to see China as an honest broker, especially if it claims to want to uphold the principles of the UN Charter, but hasn't really seen the Ukraine as a victim in this war, and hasn't clearly called Russia the aggressor, and finally also has not mentioned anything about Russia, removing troops out of occupied territory in Ukraine. So it's hard to see at this moment that China could play a constructive role.
Vladimir, oddly enough, in their joint statement that they made at the end of the visit, both Putin and Xi paid tribute to the United Nations, although they, in fact, regularly block motions that could lead to some form of proactive peacekeeping, which, of course, is ultimately the function of the UN. So why would they pay lip service to this institution that is so very much part of the old order they seem to want to overturn?
They want to create a new order, but this reference to the UN is like probably the part of the game. They just need to make on stage like symbolical step towards the toward the global audience, not only in the West, but in the places like Africa or Latin America, and the global people who are like caged in between these two battles of narrative between the West and Russia and China. So it was a reference to this audience, in my opinion, and then they go with their agenda, ignoring the Ukraine, not calling Zelensky, doing the war in the Ukraine even worse. Yeah.
Angela, in fact, Beijing refers to the relationship with Russia by a unique term that it uses for no other country, a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. How much capacity would these two autocracies actually have to revise the existing world order?
Well, I mean, I think they have both been working on changing the world order already, even before the war. And I think the difference is between China and Russia, that Russia was willing to overthrow everything for the sake of winning over Ukraine, while China is still trying, in its own perspective, very smartly, step by step, changing the world order according to its own interests. And precisely the UN is the best example how China has infiltrated and tried to influence and shape the UN institution in itself according to its own interests. So I think if they now really stand together, of course Russia will be a weaker player on many fronts, but China is ever so strong. And if they manage to actually form a bloc, not only consisting of Russia and China, but the global South, or thinking of Saudi Arabia and Iran, countries in the Middle East that used to be or are still kind of in the US camp, but you know, it's shaky, it's on shaky grounds, then I think they have great potential to alternate the existing international order.
When you look at the rhetoric of the visit, Sudha, it was hard not to conclude that this visit was at least as much about pushing back against the U.S. and the West as it was about peace and the Ukraine. Some polls, including ones that your own organization, the German Marshall Fund, has done, show an increasing hardening of attitudes, both in Europe and the U.S. when it comes to China. Isn't that a real downside of this bloc development that Angela just described? And doesn't China ultimately, also economically, need the West really more than it needs Russia?
Well, I mean, I think China is also seeing the winds go in that direction, that both, the U.S. already has there's bipartisan skepticism toward Russia, but even here in Europe, there's skepticism toward China after COVID, for example. And I think, Chancellor Scholz has talked about the turning point of Germany, and that very much includes looking at authoritarian powers with a new view and not necessarily thinking it's smart to do critical infrastructure trading with countries like Russia and China.
But if I can push once again on that point, Angela, in fact, China's trade with the U.S. is 3 times that, the worth of its trade with Russia. So isn't there a very real downside to the path that it's taking here?
Well, I mean, I think this is why I kind of also reject the idea of a new Cold War, because this is, of course, obviously, as you said, the big difference. And during the Cold War, there was not that kind of interdependency. But what we also see is that these kind of interdependencies do not stop conflict. Maybe it will stop a complete escalation, and the Third World War may still be far away as long as we see this kind of interdependence. But we see, nevertheless, a hardening of both positions. Take the balloon episode as an example of how things can escalate diplomatically. And despite the interdependence, it's a phenomenon, right? We see conflict developing further.
Vladimir, several of you have suggested that ultimately this Chinese-Russian bond is very much also about winning hearts and minds in the global South, in many of those countries, those non-aligned countries that have abstained on the UN votes condemning Russia. If that's the case, what should the West be doing to ensure, and I come back to our title here, to ensure that China and autocracy are not ultimately the winner of this protracted conflict in Ukraine?
One thing for sure, the West should invest more in the information and enlightenment of the global audience. So no cuts, no budget cuts on broadcasters in the West. No, how do you say it? Invest more in the information, because Russia investing huge amounts of money in global South to bring the narrative, to bring the view of the world situation to these people. If you travel to Africa, you find so many people completely against the United States and completely pro-Russia. There's so much sympathy for Russia in Africa. I've been recently to Nairobi in Kenya, and I was surprised how many people are reading Russia Today, how many journalists getting pieces of content from Moscow ready to print in their local newspapers, how much effort Russia putting in this informational level of conflict. So That would be, in my opinion, the one most important thing.
Sudha, Angela, same question to you very quickly, if you would. Our title asks, is China the winner here? What would you say, and what do we have to do here in the West?
Well, I mean, I think the jury is out in terms of China being the winner, because I think also China likes stability and doesn't necessarily want to have a war raging in Europe, because Europe is an important trading partner.
I agree. Yep.
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Check out our YouTube channel and tell us what you think. We're eager to hear your views.